There is a specific moment, not a scandal, not a breakdown, not a headline, but a moment most people have already forgotten that tells you everything about what happened to Kanye West's public image over the span of a decade. It was October 2004. Kanye West sat in a radio studio in New York City, headphones hanging around his neck, talking about his debut album. There was a determination in his voice, the determination of someone who had already decided he was going to change music. The College Dropout had sold more than 2 million copies in its first year of release. Critics were not just praising the album, they were treating it as a cultural event. Time magazine would later name Kanye one of the most influential people in the world. The narrative that emerged was clear and accepted almost without exception. Standing before them was a voice American music had never seen before, a truly original voice. What happened between that moment and the autumn of 2022, when headlines routinely described him as a danger, a conspiracy theorist, and an irredeemable public figure, is not simply the story of one man's unraveling. It is the story of how a media ecosystem processes a person it no longer knows how to categorize. That process did not happen overnight, and it did not happen without friction. The first significant crack in the image appeared not from a personal crisis, but from a political one. On September 2nd, 2005, during a nationally televised benefit concert for victims of Hurricane Katrina, Kanye West went off script. Standing beside comedian Mike Myers, he looked directly into the camera and said, slowly and without theatrical performance, that George Bush does not care about black people. The network cut away within seconds. The clip spread across the internet at a speed that, in 2005, still felt disorienting to most people. The reaction was immediate, and the country seemed to split in two. Millions of people who had previously been indifferent to Kanye suddenly found themselves standing against him. At the same time, there were others who viewed his remarks as one of the rare moments of honesty heard during a tightly controlled and carefully scripted media event. From a historical perspective, what mattered most was not whether his comments were right or wrong. That debate has continued for years and remains unresolved. What truly mattered was that Kanye West had for the first time become a figure onto whom large audiences tried to project meaning. Until then, he had been just a singer in the eyes of most people. After that day, he began to transform into something more than a musician, a symbol onto which different groups projected their own beliefs, frustrations, and ideas. The years between 2005 and 2009 produced the version of Kanye West that the music industry was most comfortable celebrating. Late registration in 2005, graduation in 2007, 808s, and heartbreak in 2008. Each album moved in a direction no one had predicted. The critical establishment responded with consistent admiration. And yet, even inside this period of professional success, a secondary narrative was quietly being assembled. The tabloid press had begun to notice that Kanye West was not easy to manage. He was outspoken at award ceremonies. He disagreed publicly with decisions that most artists absorbed in private. His relationship with his mother, Donda West, was documented with genuine warmth. And then in November 2007, she died following complications from cosmetic surgery. The circumstances became the subject of legal proceedings and press scrutiny that, according to those close to him, he found deeply painful. Grief, for a person who had always processed emotion through creation, does not always find its way out cleanly. The 2009 MTV Video Music Awards became such a widely discussed moment that the incident eventually took on an almost legendary status. When Kanye West suddenly grabbed the microphone from Taylor Swift while she was giving her acceptance speech, the public reaction in the days that followed felt less like a debate and more like a verdict. Even then, President Barack Obama was reported to have used an insulting remark about Kanye in a comment that later reached the press. The phrase quickly became part of popular culture. The image of Kanye standing on that stage that night became one of the most defining visuals of his public reputation. Not because it necessarily reflected the full truth, but because it was the perfect image to be replayed over and over again whenever that story was told. What is worth noting, though rarely examined, is the speed with which that single image was allowed to override nearly a decade of recorded work. A complex person was reduced to a single gesture, the gesture was repeated until it became the person, and the person was then judged entirely on that basis. It is a process that has very little to do with journalism and considerably more to do with the economics of attention. The years that followed were artistically extraordinary and publicly turbulent in ways that were difficult to separate. My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, released in November 2010, was received as one of the most accomplished albums in recent memory. Rolling Stone gave it 5 stars, Pitchfork gave it a perfect 10, and yet coverage of the album existed in parallel with a growing body of content about his behavior. The praise and the pathologizing ran simultaneously, often in the same publication. By 2013, with the release of Yeezus, the critical conversation had shifted. The music was still taken seriously, but the frame around it had changed. Interviews from this period show journalists consistently steering toward his state of mind, his volatility, rather than the work itself. In several documented exchanges, he expressed frustration with what he described as a consistent effort to reduce him to a caricature. Whether that frustration was expressed productively is a separate question. That it existed and was documented is a matter of record. The hospitalization in November 2016 marked a turning point that cannot be overstated. After canceling the remaining dates of his St. Pablo tour, he was admitted to the UCLA Medical Center. Reports cited sleep deprivation and exhaustion. In the months that followed, a diagnosis of bipolar disorder became part of the public conversation, not through a formal announcement, but through a gradual accumulation of sources and eventually his own acknowledgement in interviews and music. What happened next revealed something important about how media handles mental illness when it intersects with public behavior. The emergence of this diagnosis did not lead to a reassessment of the coverage and commentary that had surrounded Kanye for the previous decade. For many people, it could have been an opportunity to consider whether some of the behavior previously described as arrogance, anger, or a lack of self-control might also have had a medical dimension. But the public reaction went in a different direction. The bipolar disorder diagnosis was simply absorbed into the existing narrative. It was treated as just another chapter in the story that was already being told, the story of a difficult and increasingly hard-to-defend person. Yet an issue as serious as mental health required a much more careful examination. Instead of exploring that complexity, much of the media chose to continue reinforcing the narrative that already existed. At the same time, Kanye's own statements between 2018 and 2022 provided plenty of material for criticism. His remarks during a White House visit in October 2018, the controversies surrounding his 2020 presidential campaign, and the social media posts that were widely condemned as anti-Semitic all became major points of discussion. These were not stories invented by the press. They were documented events that took place in public view. The real debate centered on a different question. Were these statements the words of a man experiencing a severe psychological crisis, or did they reflect the genuine beliefs of someone whose views had become increasingly radical over time? No clear answer ever emerged. The argument continued for years and remains unresolved to this day. What is observable, however, is the way media's relationship with that complexity changed over time. In the early 2000s, there was still an effort in many outlets to hold two things simultaneously: the artist and the behavior. By the early 2020s, that effort had largely been abandoned. By October 2022, when major corporations began severing their commercial relationships with him, the narrative architecture built over nearly 2 decades was, in a sense, complete. Adidas ended its partnership with his Yeezy brand. Gap had already exited. Forbes estimated that the separation from Adidas alone removed him from the billionaire category. The business decisions were treated in most coverage as self-evident, the logical conclusion of a public record. However, the fact that a conclusion is widely accepted does not eliminate the question of how it came into existence. A person does not simply transform from a figure on the cover of Time magazine into someone whose name becomes associated with failure. That kind of transformation does not happen on its own. Behind it are editorial decisions, the way events are framed, and the repeated elevation of certain images while others are deliberately pushed into the background and allowed to fade from memory. Saying this is not an attempt to absolve Kanye of responsibility. The statements he made and the reactions of the people affected by them have become part of the historical record. But accountability and complexity are not opposites. It is possible to acknowledge that something was harmful while also questioning how the story of an entire life came to be reduced to a single narrative. That process is not unique to Kanye West. It has a history extending back through Michael Jackson, through Muhammad Ali, through any figure who is simultaneously celebrated for their distinctiveness and penalized for the same quality when it produced friction with the institutions that had benefited from them. The names change, the mechanism remains recognizable. What Kanye West's trajectory adds to that history is the role of the digital media environment. The speed at which narratives now move, the way a single image can be detached from its context and redistributed indefinitely, the economic incentives that reward conflict over nuance, these are not incidental features. They are the conditions under which his story and stories like his are now told. There are questions here that do not have clean answers. Whether the man at the center of all of this is a misunderstood artist, a person whose illness shaped his public behavior in ways that were never adequately acknowledged, or someone who made choices that cannot be attributed to any external cause, those questions remain genuinely open. Any account that resolves that ambiguity too neatly is probably resolving it too conveniently. What is less ambiguous is the shape of the narrative itself, and narratives, unlike people, can be taken apart and examined. If something in that examination unsettles your assumptions about what you thought you knew, about him, about the press, about the way public figures are built and then undone, that discomfort is probably worth sitting with. It tends to be more informative than the certainty that replaced it.